There is a truth almost no one wants to face. You can be living exactly as you're supposed to, and still be profoundly mistaken. You can have a career, stability, recognition, and still be spiritually absent from your own life. The most frightening thing is not dying. The most frightening thing is discovering at the end that you were never truly alive. We were taught to pursue security, approval, and stability, and we call that success. But what if success is just a sophisticated distraction? What if a socially correct life is, in fact, the quietest form of self-abandonment? Perhaps the greatest mistake is not failure, but never questioning the script we are obeying. The Death of Ivan Ilyich is not a story about dying. It is a story about waking up too late. About realizing at the edge that what seemed solid was only appearance. And what seemed distant, death, was the only absolute certainty. This video is not about literature. It is about you. About the choices that seem small. About the conversations you postpone. About the way you organize your life to look fine, while something inside remains restless. If there is a moment to reflect, it is now. Not in a hospital room. Not at the end. No. A socially correct life and a spiritually empty one. When I read The Death of Ivan Ilyich, I do not begin with the death. I begin with the life. And that always unsettles me. Because Ivan's life at first glance is correct. Well-adjusted. Socially validated. He did everything the way it was supposed to be done. He went to law school, built a solid career, married appropriately, cultivated useful connections. Nothing scandalous, nothing tragic, nothing wrong. And yet, something is profoundly out of alignment. This is where the work stops being merely literature and becomes a mirror. Because Ivan's tragedy does not begin with illness. It begins with normalcy. It begins with the pursuit of a socially acceptable life instead of an inwardly truthful one. Tolstoy does not present us with a villain. He presents us with an ordinary man. And perhaps that is what makes it so uncomfortable. When I look at Ivan, I see a psychological pattern that transcends centuries. Identity constructed through the gaze of others. Status, title, recognition, comparison. He does not choose his profession out of vocation, but out of suitability. He does not marry out of deep love, but out of harmonious convenience. He arranges his home as a symbol of success. Every decision is guided by social logic, not by inner listening. A quiet but essential word emerges here: alienation. Not in a political sense but in an existential one. Ivan is alienated from himself. He is not a bad man. He is a disconnected man. Disconnected from his own center. And this disconnection does not hurt at first. It is comfortable. It is rewarded. It is applauded. How often do we confuse applause with meaning? How often do we structure our lives to appear solid on the outside while something inside remains undefined? The career advances. The goals are achieved. The calendar is full. But there is an inner space that has never been consciously inhabited. And that is dangerous because it does not scream. It simply falls silent. Tolstoy shows us that Ivan learns to live according to a model. He learns how to act, how to speak, how to decide. He internalizes a norm. He constructs what depth psychology would call a persona, the social mask that organizes our adaptation to the world. The persona is not the problem in itself. The problem arises when it replaces the soul. Modern life is saturated with this substitution. From an early age, we learn to perform competence, composure, success. We learn to smile in professional settings, maintain composure in family conflict, project stability on social media. The question we almost never ask is, where am I in all of this? Ivan lives appropriately. That word is central. Appropriate for the position. Appropriate for the social tier. Appropriate for others' expectations. Rarely appropriate for his inner truth. And the most unsettling part is that he does not realize it. He is not pretending. He genuinely believes he is living well. This is the first stage of sleeping consciousness, living without questioning the structure of one's own life. There is no malice in it. There is conditioning. There is fear of exclusion. There is the desire to belong. These impulses are deeply human. But when they are not balanced by authenticity, they create an existence that is aesthetically organized and spiritually fragile. I imagine Ivan arranging his new house, selecting furniture, debating decorative details. Tolstoy describes it with almost ironic precision. The house becomes a symbol of stability. But symbolically, it reveals something else. He is building exterior walls while remaining without interior architecture. Here begins the first invisible crack. When identity is sustained solely by external validation, it depends on the world to keep existing. The title must be maintained, the status reaffirmed, the image preserved. Life becomes the constant maintenance of a narrative. You may be thinking, what is wrong with wanting stability? With pursuing success? Nothing. The issue is not what we do, it is where we do it from. Motivation, awareness, presence, alignment between outer action and inner truth. Ivan is not punished for succeeding. He is confronted for never asking who he was beyond success. And when that question is ignored for too long, it does not disappear. It waits. It waits for silence. It waits for rupture. It waits for something that disrupts the surface in order to reveal the depths. The discomfort begins here, not in physical pain, but in the late realization that perhaps life has been built on a fragile axis. If that realization has not yet come to us, it may be because we are too busy maintaining appearances. The story still appears calm. There is no obvious crisis. But there is subtle tension. Because when life is lived only in the social dimension, the spiritual dimension remains suspended. And nothing suspended indefinitely remains stable. It is precisely in this seemingly secure normalcy that something begins to move. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. The illusion of everything's fine. When consciousness sleeps standing up. There is a specific moment in Ivan Ilyich's life when everything appears perfectly stable. He has secured his position in the court. His home reflects respectability. His social relationships function within predictable protocol. If someone asked whether he was happy, he would likely say yes, or at least that he was satisfied. This is where the work becomes dangerously contemporary. The greatest illusion is not believing everything is wonderful. The greatest illusion is believing that everything's fine. That good enough state. That manageable comfort. That lukewarm existence that does not disturb us enough to provoke transformation. Human consciousness has a remarkable capacity for adaptation. We acclimate to routines that do not inspire us, to conversations that do not nourish us, to jobs that do not represent us, to relationships that function as silent contracts. Over time, adaptation becomes identity. We begin to call life what is often merely maintenance. Ivan lives in this refined state of adaptation. He avoids deep conflict. When his marriage shows strain, he does not confront emotional emptiness. He retreats into work. When discomfort arises, he seeks distraction. He does not descend. He circumvents. This ability to bypass one's own truth is one of the most sophisticated forms of escape. A crucial term emerges here: psychic anesthesia. It is not that Ivan feels nothing. It is that he feels only what is manageable. He organizes his life to avoid prolonged contact with existential questions. Who am I beyond my title? What truly matters? If all of this collapses, what remains? This anesthesia is not deliberate. It is cultural. We are trained to function, to produce, to meet benchmarks, education, career advancement, homeownership, family, retirement accounts. When we accomplish these efficiently, we are labeled successful. Rarely are we taught to pause and ask, does this make sense to my soul? The illusion of everything's fine is comfortable because it spares us unrest. Yet unrest is the beginning of awakening. Awakening requires discomfort. It requires admitting that the architecture of our lives may be built on external expectations rather than internal convictions. And that can destabilize everything. Tolstoy describes Ivan's routine with almost bureaucratic coldness. Hearings, decisions, social engagements. Life unfolds on surface layers. When we live only at the surface, we avoid the depths, and meaning resides in the depths. How many people today live in this same state? Wake up, commute, work, handle demands, come home, scroll, stream, sleep. Repeat. There is not necessarily acute suffering, but there is also no intense presence. It is a functional life. Functionality is not fulfillment. Sleeping consciousness is not intellectual ignorance. Often it is technical competence combined with inner unawareness. One can be highly intelligent and profoundly unconscious about one's own existence. Ivan is competent, respected, and distant from himself. The longer we inhabit an unquestioned structure, the harder it becomes to question it. Because questioning implies recognizing that we may have invested years, even decades, in something that does not fully represent us. That recognition hurts. So we maintain everything's fine. Small distractions, small wins, small reassurances. Life becomes a sequence of external adjustments while the center remains untouched. What is untouched is not integrated. The soul does not tolerate indefinite neglect. It does not shout at first. It whispers. A subtle discomfort. A hollow feeling in the middle of an achievement. A question that surfaces before sleep. If we remain distracted, the whisper intensifies. Ivan believes he is living as one should live. He measures himself by social standards, and by those standards he excels. But adequacy is not authenticity. Adequacy secures belonging. Authenticity demands courage. A nearly invisible tension begins to vibrate. When consciousness sleeps standing up, it awakens only when something knocks it down. Life sometimes interrupts routine to reveal what routine concealed. Everything's fine begins to crack, not through immediate collapse but through subtle dissonance. Something does not fully satisfy. Something does not quite align. Yet it is still possible to ignore. For now. The first sign of rupture. The body as messenger of truth. The rupture in Ivan Ilyich's life does not begin as dramatic tragedy. It begins with something apparently trivial, physical discomfort. A pain in his side. A persistent irritation. Too small to cause alarm, too insistent to ignore. The body often speaks when consciousness refuses to listen. What begins as a symptom carries, on a psychological and existential level, the function of interruption. The straight line of life develops a fracture. How many times has the body tried to warn us? Lingering fatigue, chronic tension, insomnia, diffuse anxiety, recurring headaches. Not always severe illness, but signals, signs that something is misaligned between how we live and what our interiority can sustain. For Ivan, the pain is not just pain. It is the beginning of the disorganization of the narrative he constructed about himself. As long as he was healthy, his identity felt solid. Competent judge. Respectable man. Integrated member of society. The body functioned as an invisible ally of the persona. When the body falters, the mask begins to crack. Our sense of control depends heavily on physical stability. When health wavers, permanence wavers. Vulnerability emerges. The body is the territory of concrete truth. We can lie socially. We can rationalize emotions. We can justify choices. The body does not negotiate. It registers accumulation, stress, repression, incongruence. It stores what has not been processed. Ivan seeks medical opinions, technical explanations, objective answers. He wants to convert existential uncertainty into a manageable clinical issue. This is profoundly human. Faced with the unknown, we seek protocol. But what disturbs him is not only pain, it is ambiguity, not knowing, the absence of guarantees. Medicine offers terms and hypotheses, not certainty. And the lack of certainty erodes internal stability. The pain becomes a metaphor for psychic rupture. For the first time, Ivan is forced to interrupt automatic living. He cannot simply work more. He cannot distract himself indefinitely. The pain calls him inward. Illness often represents a threshold, not punishment but transition. The old way of being no longer holds, the new has not yet formed. An ambiguous in-between. Ivan interprets it as threat, not initiation. When identity is built on external stability, internal instability feels like destruction. A key word emerges: control. For the first time, he realizes he does not control what is essential. He can manage court decisions, arguments, procedures. He cannot command his own organism. For an ego accustomed to order, this is devastating. The pain introduces an irreversible question. What if my life is not as solid as I imagined? The rupture is not yet total. There is still hope, still denial. But previous tranquility is gone. Pain does not automatically awaken. Sometimes it isolates. And that isolation now deepens. Invisible loneliness, when no one can feel for us. As Ivan's illness progresses, something even more painful than the symptom itself emerges: loneliness. Not merely external solitude, people are still around him, but existential isolation. Suffering is intransferable. We can describe it, dramatize it, analyze it. No one feels exactly what we feel. There is an invisible boundary between inner experience and the gaze of the other. Ivan perceives that his pain is inconvenient. His wife remains practical. Colleagues visit formally. Conversations revolve around schedules and diagnoses. Life attempts to normalize what for him is collapse. Inside, he feels fear and mounting anguish. Outside, social protocol continues. The dissonance intensifies isolation. He feels managed, not understood. We have all experienced versions of this. The world does not stop for our crisis. Others continue their routines. This is not cruelty, it is structure. But it is lonely. In confronting finitude, we are radically alone. We may receive care, but no one can die for us. No one can face our own consciousness approaching its limit. Social belonging does not resolve existential anguish. Ivan was integrated, respected, appropriate. Now that integration offers no foundation. Incommunicability emerges. Not because he cannot speak but because language feels insufficient. How do you translate the fear of non-existence? He resents superficiality. What angers him most is collective denial of death. Society operates as though death were abstract. When it becomes concrete, symbolic systems falter. People default to convention. What he needs is not protocol but truth. Someone who acknowledges reality without softening it. Loneliness also reflects a life that never cultivated deep intimacy. He built functional relationships, not necessarily authentic ones. Now, when depth is required, he encounters surface. If we avoid essential conversations for years, we build bonds based on roles, not presence. When the role collapses, what remains? Loneliness becomes a mirror, not only of distance from others but distance from oneself. Anguish intensifies, and with it revolt. Revolt against the inevitable, the ego fighting reality. As illness advances, revolt intensifies. Not only fear but indignation. How can a life so carefully organized end so arbitrarily? The ego first resists. Why me? As if death were a bureaucratic error. He believed life operated on merit. He followed the script. In that logic, illness feels like miscalculation. But existence does not function on moral guarantees. Death does not review resumes. He seeks more doctors, more opinions. A technical solution to an existential rupture. Revolt preserves identity. Acceptance would require admitting loss of control. That threatens an ego built on order. Existential denial surfaces. We avoid thinking about finitude. We behave as though time were unlimited. Revolt externalizes conflict. It is easier to blame than to confront inner emptiness. But revolt has limits. Pain persists. Weakness grows. Reality insists. A deeper fear emerges, not just of death but of what death reveals. The terror of death and the terror of not having lived. Eventually revolt weakens. Death becomes psychological experience. The terror is not only ceasing to exist. It is meaninglessness. The fear that the carefully constructed life never touched what was essential. He remembers childhood, spontaneity, aliveness, authenticity. In contrast, adulthood appears constructed. A devastating suspicion arises. In trying to be correct, did I fail to be true? Authenticity becomes central. Adequate but not authentic. Death becomes illumination. It strips distraction. It exposes priorities. Was my life what it should have been? This is not society judging him. It is conscience awakening. Death becomes catalyst for truth. It removes narrative. It leaves the essential question. Did I live aligned with what was most real in me? Fear becomes ontological. Meaning itself is threatened. The question could have been asked earlier. It was not. Life was too busy being managed. Now consciousness awakens under urgency. And in that terror, something unexpected appears. A simple presence. The mirror of Gerasim. Simplicity revealing truth. Amid social artificiality emerges Gerasim, a young peasant, simple, direct. No rhetoric. No sophistication. Yet he embodies the deepest humanity in the narrative. He does not minimize reality. He does not deny death. He is present. While others preserve appearances, Gerasim sustains truth without drama. He physically supports Ivan, but also supports reality without evasion. Authenticity embodied. He does not theorize about death. He accepts it as part of life. For Ivan, this is liberating. No image to protect. No persona to maintain. Paradoxically, this simplicity reveals greater spiritual maturity than social refinement. Ivan feels relief in Gerasim's presence. Not because pain disappears but because pretense does. How often relief comes not from solution, but from someone before whom we need not pretend. Gerasim represents integration. No split between appearance and essence. Refinement did not prepare Ivan for death. Simplicity did. What prepares us for the inevitable? Status? Recognition? Or coherence? Gerasim legitimizes Ivan's suffering. And that recognition is therapeutic. True spirituality is not elevated discourse. It is presence before truth. Something opens in Ivan. A fissure in resistance. He glimpses another way of being, less performance, more essence. But perception is not integration. The mask still resists. And its collapse will not be gentle. The fall of the masks, when the persona can no longer hold. There comes a point in Ivan Ilyyich's journey when the mask simply stops working. It isn't a conscious decision. It isn't a dramatic gesture. It is exhaustion. The persona, that carefully constructed social identity, can no longer withstand the pressure of reality. Up to this point, Ivan was still trying to maintain some external coherence. He was still trying to appear rational, dignified, in control. But now, the constant pain, the deep fatigue, and the concrete nearness of death begin to dissolve any possibility of performance. And this is devastating, but also liberating. Because the persona is a protective structure. It organizes our relationship with the world. It allows us to function socially. But when we identify with it completely, we forget that it is only a layer of the psyche, not our essential center. Ivan begins to experience something like an identity collapse. He is no longer the competent judge. No longer the respected man. No longer the socially appropriate husband. He is a vulnerable human being facing the end. And at this point, a key word emerges: disidentification. Even if involuntarily, he begins to disidentify from his roles. Titles lose importance. Formalities seem absurd. What once felt urgent now appears trivial. This does not happen with immediate serenity. There is anguish. There is resistance. There is a sense of loss. Because when the mask falls, we do not immediately know who we are without it. How often do we cling to roles to avoid the essential question? Who am I without what I do? Who am I without the recognition I receive? Who am I when no one is watching? The fall of the mask is always uncomfortable because it exposes what we have avoided for years. And Ivan begins to sense that perhaps he spent more time trying to measure up than trying to understand himself. This realization does not arrive as a clear philosophical concept. It is felt as a deep unrest, as if something were being torn away. The physical pain intensifies this process. His fragile body makes any return to his former identity impossible. There is no going back to routine. No pretending everything is normal. The life that sustained the persona no longer exists. And in this emptying, a rare possibility emerges: to look inward without distraction. But looking inward requires courage. Because what we find may not be comfortable. It may be regret. It may be the recognition of superficiality. It may be the awareness that we have lived by standards that now feel insufficient. Ivan begins to feel that something is wrong with the entire narrative he built about his life. He can no longer sustain the belief that everything was as it should have been. That phrase begins to lose its meaning. And as it loses meaning, it opens space for a more honest question. What if I have been wrong about everything? This is the point of greatest psychological vulnerability. Because when external structures collapse, we are invited to confront the core of our own consciousness. It is not beautiful. It is not romantic. It is raw, direct, human. But it is also the threshold of transformation. Because when there are no more masks, only the truth remains. And truth, however painful, carries within it the possibility of liberation. Inner surrender, when resisting hurts more than letting go. After the rebellion, after the terror, after the fall of the masks, Ivan Ilyich reaches a point of inner exhaustion. Not merely physical exhaustion, that is already evident, but a deep psychological fatigue. It is as if fighting has become more painful than facing reality. There comes a moment in human experience when resisting requires more energy than accepting. And it is at this threshold that surrender becomes possible. But surrender here does not mean defeat. It does not mean passivity. It means ending the internal war against what is already real. Ivan spends days in agony, physical and existential. He oscillates between fear and reflection, between denial and lucidity, until something begins to shift in the quality of his perception. He starts to suspect that perhaps the suffering is not only in death, but in the resistance to death. This is a radical shift in perspective. As long as he fought reality, the pain felt endless. But when he begins, even timidly, to look inward with honesty, something reorganizes. A decisive key word appears here: conscious acceptance. Not mechanical resignation, not bitter giving up, but a deep recognition that something greater than the ego's instinct to preserve itself is at work. Ivan begins to review his life with greater clarity. He sees that many of his choices were guided by fear of not belonging, by the desire for approval, by the pursuit of social security. And in recognizing this, he feels a mixture of sadness and lucidity. That lucidity hurts, but it also illuminates. For the first time, he is not trying to defend his narrative. He is examining it. And in examining it, an unexpected compassion arises. He begins to understand that he lived the only way he knew how. That he followed the patterns he had been taught. That there was no deliberate malice, only unconsciousness. This recognition softens something within him. Inner surrender occurs when he stops asking, "Why me?" and quietly begins asking, "What is true now?" This shift moves the focus from the past to the present. And in that present he perceives something transformative. There is still the possibility of truth. Even at the end. Even in pain. Even in the nearness of death. Surrender does not erase physical suffering. But it alters the quality of the experience. Resistance creates tension. Acceptance creates space. And in that space something begins to emerge. Something that is neither despair nor rebellion nor terror. It is a kind of openness. As if, by stopping the fight against the inevitable, he begins to move through it. There is a profound spiritual paradox here. What we fear most may become the portal to our deepest clarity. Ivan begins to sense that death may not be merely the end of biological life, but the end of an illusion. The end of an identity based solely on appearances. The end of inner disconnection. And as he touches that possibility, something within him relaxes. It is not euphoria. Not superficial happiness. It is a different stillness. A stillness that arises when we finally stop running from ourselves. This is the silent turning point of the narrative. But transformation must still become embodied. It must still become lived experience. And that is what prepares the ground for the final movement. Life before death. The story of a man who woke up in time. I want to tell you a story now. It is not Ivan's story. It is the story of someone who could be me. Or you. Or anyone who spent years believing that everything was fine. His name is Daniel. Daniel was 47 years old. An attorney. Married. 2 teenage children. A comfortable condo in a desirable neighborhood. A full calendar. Respected at his firm. Organized. Punctual. Functional. If someone asked who he was, the answer came quickly. Competent professional, responsible father, balanced man. And for a long time he believed it. But there was something he never named. A fatigue that was not physical. A mild, constant irritability. A sense that everything was happening, except him. Daniel was not unhappy. That is the point. He simply was not deeply alive. One evening, after an ordinary day, he felt a sharp pain in his chest. Not intense enough to collapse, but enough to frighten him. He went to the ER. Test. Waiting. Silence. The diagnosis was not severe, but it was a warning. High stress. Real risk if the pace continued. On the drive home, something different happened. Not panic. A question. If I had died today, what would my life have been? The question echoed. In the days that followed, Daniel tried to return to normal. Meetings, deadlines, commitments. But something had shifted. Conversations felt repetitive. Concerns seemed smaller than they once did. He began to observe his own life as if he were slightly outside of it. And he noticed something unsettling. Nearly all his decisions had been based on security and recognition. He chose his major for stability. He chose opportunities for salary progression. He maintained certain relationships out of convenience. He had never stopped to ask what truly moved him. This realization did not lead him to abandon everything. There was no dramatic gesture. There was something harder, honesty. Daniel started small. He began saying no, where he once would have said yes, out of obligation. He set aside real time to talk with his children, not just to ask about grades but to listen to fears, insecurities, dreams. He began walking alone in the mornings without headphones, without distraction. Just walking. Just breathing. Just noticing. He began writing. Not to publish, but to understand. Simple questions on paper. What truly matters? What am I postponing out of fear? If I had 5 years to live, what would I change? Those questions began to reorganize his consciousness. He realized he had apologized too often for who he was. That he had softened opinions to avoid displeasing others. That he had chosen neutrality in moments that required a stand. And slowly he began to live with greater coherence. He did not suddenly become wealthy. He did not quit his profession. He did not become a monk. He simply aligned small actions with deeper values. He reduced his working hours and increased his presence. He spoke with his wife about distances that had never been named. He sought therapy, not because he was in collapse but because he wanted to know himself. There was discomfort. There was tension. Some people were surprised. But something within him began to stabilize in a new way. It was not external stability. It was inner integrity. Years later, Daniel faced another health crisis. This time more serious. But the experience was different. He did not feel the same terror. He did not feel the same sense of an unlived life. There was fear, yes, but there was no structural regret. Because he had done something essential. He had woken up before the end. That is the quiet synthesis of the death of Ivan Ilyich. Death is not merely a biological event. It is a A mirror that asks, are you living or merely functioning? Most of us do not need a terminal diagnosis to ask that question, but we almost always wait for rupture to wake up. Perhaps the invitation is different. Perhaps the invitation is to bring the awareness of finitude into the present, not as a threat but as clarity. If you knew your time was limited, and it is, what would change today? Which conversation would you stop postponing? Which decision would you make more truthfully? What part of you is waiting for permission to exist? Ivan found lucidity at the threshold of death. Daniel found lucidity at the threshold of a scare. And you? Life before death is the only life we have.